Good morning, brothers and sisters, and please join me in the exploration of one of the shortest letters in the New Testament. My name is Reverend Dr. Charles Kebaranyaga from the diaspora here in the United States of America. Welcome to our Sunday morning worship. The letter by Paul to his friend Philemon is a one-page letter which sounds more like a court case in the way Paul presents his 14-point closing arguments in favor of a runaway slave. I encourage you to read the letter for yourself, reading it slowly to learn the import of developing a Christian petition on behalf of potential disciples for your congregation. In this episode, we meet a slave who was hunted and a fugitive and was also in constant danger of his life. His name is Onesimus. Onesimus is another ancient word for, in quote, useful, that Paul used playfully to make the case for Onesimus. Paul's argument was that a runaway slave is useless, which was contingent upon the fact that if Philemon received the returning slave in the right spirit, then he would become a useful person for and to Philemon. The story of Onesimus is almost a copyright of what many slaves have endured in many places in the world for many generations, as you may know. Is it too far-fetched to imagine that slavery still exists in this era? Is it? If you recall, the children of Israel were enslaved for many years in Egypt before Moses came along. The Israelites received mercy from God by the way God pushed the unwilling Moses to emancipate the slaves from the hands of the Egyptian Pharaoh, as we read in the Old Testament. Many slaves and prisoners never get to receive mercy as Onesimus did through the goodness of and the advocacy of Paul the Apostle. The runaway Onesimus had two options to choose from. Either, one, he could have spent all his days hiding in dark, grimy alleys of a Roman city somewhere, dodging the security apparatus and bounty hunters, or he could have surrendered and gone back to his master altogether and suffer the dire consequences waiting for him. Either way, Onesimus had difficulties and choices to make. He was living his life between a rock and a hard place. As you may know, historically, the Roman Empire had initiated harsh laws to control the public discourse, but more so regarding the slaves. If Onesimus decided to return to Philemon, his master, Philemon had the legal power to have the runaway slave executed upon arrival. If Philemon, for some reason, mercifully decided not to execute the runaway slave, Onesimus would have forever have had the letter F tattooed on his forehead for life. And the tattoos and the nature of those tattoos in the day is that they were seared on the forehead using a hot rod during the Roman Empire. Think about that for a minute. Onesimus was in a place you never want to find yourself for whatever reason. Then Paul joins this drama. Paul is now acting more like an attorney for Onesimus. But the case for Onesimus becomes very complicated because of his conversion to Christ. Onesimus knew very well that he could not stay on the run forever. According to the law in the Roman Empire, Onesimus had committed a crime against his legal owner. Friends, I shudder at the thought of a person owning another person as property. It is repulsive. That is the world of slave-master relationship. Onesimus concluded that he needed to make amends with his legal owner, Philemon. That is where Paul's skills came to bear. If you look at the line number 17 of the letter, Paul says this to Philemon, quote, "If you consider me a partner, welcome him as you welcome me as a brother," end of quote. Paul is writing this letter to a friend to ask for a big favor, for a man's life depends on the outcome. According to historians, as many as 60 million slaves served in the Roman Empire across the known world at that time. The Roman Empire ruled the world centuries before and after Christ was born. In this court case drama that we are listening to, Paul uses his masterful skills of both persuasion and diplomacy in pleading with the tycoon Philemon. Onesimus' life hung in the balance. Paul uses measured but consistent pressure in the way the 14-point arguments are presented to Philemon on behalf of Onesimus. A pattern of Paul's themes in this argument begins to emerge in the address to Philemon. Paul begins with a formal greeting before he makes his 14-point argument. Paul addresses the good in Philemon and his love for the saints in verse 5. Then Paul asserts his authority, verse 7, which he waives in verse 9. In his argument, Paul turns up additional force in verse 9. Paul refers to their spiritual relationship in verse 10. Paul then appeals to Philemon's own interests in verse 11. Paul uses his strong affection for Onesimus by urging Philemon to take him back on, verse 12. Apostle Paul willingly gave up his rights in sending Onesimus back to Philemon in verse 13 and 14. He tells Philemon not to be afraid that Onesimus would run away again, verse 15. He then sets the conditions under which Onesimus would return to Philemon, verse 16. Paul then refers to the communion of saints in verse 17. Again, Paul promises Philemon's satisfaction with the deal in verses 18 and 19 according to the argument. Paul enumerates the joy and comfort on Philemon's account and on Onesimus' faith and obedience, verse 20. In his closing arguments, like a good lawyer, Paul points to the good hope and opinion which he expresses towards Philemon, verse 21. In this episode, brothers and sisters, several things jump out for me. First, Paul is extremely careful in how he proceeds with his petition for Onesimus by the way he crafted his phrases in the letter. Second, Paul uses his connections and diplomatic skills to make the petition. Third, Paul uses his influence and status, a Christian leader, appealing to Philemon's sense of love and compassion. Fourth, Paul does not outright order Philemon to consent, and yet Paul applies just enough pressure in the 19th line, saying to Philemon, quote, "You owe me your very self," end of quote. Fifth, Paul turns up the pressure using Philemon's church membership and promising a personal visit in line number 22 of the letter. Now, having said that, what does this letter mean to you? What does it mean to all of us? What does it invoke? Well, let us talk about what Paul's letter to Philemon may be telling us in the present. First, we have learned that Paul took the initiative to petition for Onesimus after the two men met in a Roman jail. Remember that Paul was familiar with jails and prisons, having been in and out of them many times over. Second, we also learned that Paul did not forget his prison mate when he was released from prison. That is why his compassion led him to advocate for Onesimus. But scholars also believe that Onesimus had heard about Paul in the same prison they both shared at some point. Third, when you come closer to Christ, brothers and sisters, through conversion, at first, life can become very complicated because of the new you. It can be very confusing to you and even the people around you. Fourth, slavery lasted for at least another 1,800 years after Paul's letter to Philemon. It took the full moral force of Christianity to abolish slavery across the globe, at least from what we understand. We would be wise to ask whether slavery, the physical denial of freedom by one person to another, still exists, or perhaps it persists in some other form. Christ can revolutionize any relationship. God can change circumstances that seem impossible to the human eye. There is no between a rock and a hard place with God. We see persuasion and diplomatic skills that can work in many disciples and bringing them into Christ's fold. This is a Christian diplomacy at its best. We also see a man, Paul, who does not forget his friend who was left behind bars. He advocated for him, knowing all too well the consequences of his inaction. We all have friends and acquaintances, brothers and sisters. We have neighbors, and even people we do not know who should be priority number one in our ministry of compassion. We see that the faith had a profound impact on slavery long before abolition. Finally, here is a significant interpretation to take note of as you read the letter to Philemon. Note that the word doulos in the Greek language represents both servant and slave. How then you choose to use one meaning over the other will depend on the context and the intended meaning, and that is either as an oppressed slave or a fellow worker, a civil servant, for example. This will be your judgment call to make. Responsible interpreters should always take into account the context in which the choice of words aligns with the intended message and thoughts of both the transmitter and the recipient. In closing, let us remember that, number one, our dependence is on God for life, liberty, and opportunity for service. Two, summarizing this or any other mercies that God provides, our trust and hope must always be in God, without succumbing while we wait for the pending case, as we wait for the Lord to answer us. Number three, trust must be in the use of means, prayers, and especially through which we can unlock heaven's doors and open prison gates. 4, prayers by ministers are their greatest duty for people in distress and danger. Though prayer obtains, yet it does not merit the things obtained. They are God's gift and Christ's purchase. Pray anyway and be an advocate for others. You now have at least a model in Paul to follow, according to Paul's letter to Philemon. This is a good model for all of us to follow in bringing our brothers and sisters who may be incarcerated in prisons across the globe, or people who may be in distress. We can advocate for them using this very simple model, the letter to Philemon by Paul. Peace be with you all, and amen.